The house breathed around her, a slow, sighing respiration of old wood and damp stone. For 6 years, Lyra had learned its language, the groan of the floorboards under the weight of a nightmare, the rattle of a windowpane in its frame that spoke of a coming storm, the soft, settled silence that meant all 7 of her children were, for now, asleep and safe. This was the sanctuary, a name far grander than the crumbling manse deserved, tucked away in a fold of the mountains so deep the rest of the world had forgotten it existed. It was a place of last resort, a haven for the impossible, a home for those who had no other. Lyra moved through the sleeping house on silent feet, her path worn into the very grain of the wood. Her body was a map of exhaustion, each muscle a line drawn taut with the constant, humming tension of vigilance. She checked the latch on the main door first, her fingers tracing the familiar iron, cold and solid beneath her touch. Then, the heavy bar, its weight a small, grim comfort. She moved to the windows, her gaze sweeping not the glass, but the faint, shimmering lines of the wards she renewed each night before she dared to sleep. They pulsed with a soft, silver light, visible only to her, a fragile net cast against a world that would tear her children apart. They were half-bloods, all 7 of them. Born of unions forbidden by the rigid, unforgiving laws of 2 worlds that refused to touch. They were seen as abominations by one parent's people, as betrayals by the others. Hunted, feared, and alone, until they found their way, or were brought, to her door. She was their mother in every way that mattered, the fierce, unyielding center of their small, precarious universe. Her last stop was always the long dormitory room where they slept. The air was warm and smelled of clean linen, soap, and the sweet, milky scent of sleeping children. 7 small chests rose and fell in the moonlight that filtered through the tall, arched window. There was Finn, his fey heritage showing in the sharp, delicate points of his ears, curled on his side with his thumb in his mouth. Ilara and Mathis, twins born of a dryad, whose hair seemed to capture the moonlight and hold it fast. Young Kale, whose skin held the faint, stony texture of his dwarven father, snoring with a sound far too big for his little body. 2 more, each a unique and perfect blend of warring bloodlines, each a miracle she would die to protect. And then there was Rose. Lyra's gaze always lingered on Rose. The girl slept near the window, as if she craved the touch of the outside world even in her dreams. Her hair was the color of dark wine, spilling across a pillow that had been embroidered with fading, anonymous care. She was the quietest of the children, her presence a gentle weight in the house. She spoke more to the plants in the garden than to people, and had a strange, innate understanding of the woods that bordered the sanctuary. Lyra had found her on the doorstep 8 years ago, a swaddled infant in a finely woven basket, with nothing but a single, perfect rose petal resting on her blanket. Lyra knelt by her bed, her hand hovering, wanting to smooth the hair from the girl's brow but not daring to wake her. It was on Rose's small bedside table that the gifts always appeared. Over the years, a steady, silent stream of them. A doll carved from a single piece of sun-bleached driftwood, its face serene and knowing. A mobile of polished river stones that chimed with a sound only Rose seemed to truly hear. A small, leather-bound book filled with exquisite drawings of herbs and flowers, its pages smelling of cedar and something ancient, like thunderstorms and old earth. Tonight, there was another. Perched on the corner of the table, so new it seemed to have materialized from the moonlight itself, was a small, exquisitely carved wooden nightingale. Its head was cocked, its tiny beak open as if in mid-song. The detail was breathtaking, each feather rendered with impossible precision. A familiar chill, equal parts gratitude and fear, traced its way down Lyra's spine. Someone was watching them. A guardian, it seemed, a benefactor who asked for nothing and gave these small, beautiful treasures. But the secrecy of it gnawed at her. This ghost, this shadow who knew of their hidden place, was a loose thread in the tightly woven tapestry of their safety. She had spent years convincing herself it was a benevolent spirit, a friendly ghost tied to the old house. But in the deepest, most honest parts of her soul, she knew it was a person. Someone who stood outside their wards, someone who could breach them at will to leave these tokens, and who chose, for reasons she could not fathom, to remain unknown. She reached out, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool wood of the bird. "Who were you?" she thought, the question a silent plea sent into the sleeping house. What do you want from us? The house sighed around her, offering no answers. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying secrets she wasn't meant to hear. Lyra drew the blanket higher over Rose's shoulder, her love for the child a fierce, painful ache in her chest. She would protect them. From the hunters, from the world, and even, if she must, from the ghost who left gifts in the night. From the deep shadows of the ancient pine forest that bordered the sanctuary's grounds, Adrian watched the light in the dormitory window extinguish. He remained perfectly still, a statue carved from twilight and regret, his form blending so seamlessly with the darkness that even the keen eyes of a nocturnal predator would have passed him by. He could feel the pulse of Lyra's wards against his senses, a faint, silvery thrum that was both a barrier and a testament to her strength. He could have walked through them as easily as walking through mist, but he never did. He respected the line she had drawn against the world. He was part of that world. His gaze was fixed on the window where his daughter slept. Rose. A name chosen by the woman who had given her life to birth her, a name he had only ever whispered to the unhearing wind. A curse bound him, an ancient and vicious piece of magic woven by a defeated rival in their last, dying moments. You will have an heir of your blood, but you will never know her. The moment you claim her, the moment your tongue speaks her name as your own, her heart will still in her chest. Your love will be her death. For 8 years, that curse had been a shard of ice embedded in his soul. He had found this place, this forgotten corner of the world run by a woman with a spine of steel and a heart of impossible softness, and had entrusted his only child to her care, a silent, desperate prayer. He could not be her father. He could not hold her, teach her, or comfort her when she cried. But he could watch. He could guard. He had been here tonight, as he was every night. A silent sentinel in the trees. He had watched Lyra make her rounds, her slender form moving with a weary grace that broke his heart. He had seen the way she paused by Rose's bed, the infinite tenderness in the gesture as she adjusted the blanket. He had felt the weight of her unspoken question as she discovered the nightingale he had left. It had taken him 3 weeks to carve it, pouring every ounce of his stifled love into the grain of the wood, hoping the child would feel some echo of it. In the beginning, his vigil had been only for Rose. He had watched Lyra with a critical, detached eye, assessing her worthiness as a guardian. He saw her patience, her resilience, her courage. He saw her mend clothes with calloused fingers, stretch their meager food supplies with clever invention, and face down the darkness of the world with nothing but the sheer force of her will. But somewhere along the way, his observation had changed. It had deepened, softened, transformed into something else entirely. He remembered the night Finn had woken screaming from a nightmare, and Lyra had held the small, trembling boy for hours, humming a low, tuneless song until his breathing evened out. He remembered the day she had taught the twins to weave crowns from wildflowers, her laughter a bright, clear sound in the overgrown garden. He remembered her standing on the porch during a thunderstorm, her face turned up to the rain, a fleeting, beautiful smile on her lips as if she were embracing the storm's wildness. He had fallen in love with her. It was a hopeless, agonizing love, born of shadow and silence. He loved her for the fierce, protective fire in her eyes. He loved her for the exhaustion she carried so gracefully. He loved her for the way she gave everything she had to these children, his child, without a thought for herself. She was the mother Rose deserved, the mother he could never provide. Lyra was sunlight, warmth, and fierce, tangible love. He was a creature of night, a king of a shadowed court, his heart a cold, empty throne room. A twig snapped in the distance. Adrian's head came up, his posture shifting from mournful stillness to predatory alertness. His senses, honed over centuries, reached out into the forest. He caught the scent on the wind, the acrid smell of iron, the faint, greasy odor of dark magic, and the unmistakable stench of greed. Hunters. 2 of them, moving carelessly, arrogantly, thinking themselves masters of the wood. They were still miles away, following a cold trail, but their presence was a violation. A low growl rumbled in his chest. His form seemed to bleed into the deeper shadows, his eyes glowing with a faint, dangerous light. He would not allow them to get any closer. He would be the monster in the dark that the other monsters feared. He would eliminate the threat, and Lyra would never know. She would sleep, believing her wards and her vigilance were what kept the children safe. And he would let her. He would bear the loneliness of being their unseen, unknown protector, because her peace was worth more to him than his own recognition. He moved through the trees, a silent wraith, a king defending a kingdom that did not know he existed, his heart full of a love he could never speak and a rage he was about to unleash. The next morning broke pale and damp, the world outside washed in shades of grey. A fine mist clung to the ground, muffling sound and making the sanctuary feel even more isolated than usual. Inside, the day began with its familiar rhythm. Lyra was the first to rise, coaxing a fire to life in the great stone hearth of the kitchen. The scent of porridge and wood smoke slowly filled the house, a comforting anchor in the quiet dawn. One by one, the children emerged, sleepy and soft-eyed, drawn by the warmth and the promise of breakfast. Finn immediately began chattering about a dream involving a river made of honey. The twins, Ilara and Mathis, moved in their usual silent tandem, setting the long wooden table with bowls and spoons. Rose was the last to appear, clutching the new wooden nightingale in her hand. Her dark eyes were wide with a quiet wonder. She didn't speak, but walked directly to Lyra and held the bird up for her to see, a silent offering of shared delight. Lyra's heart clenched. She forced a warm smile, taking the small carving in her hands. "It's beautiful, little flower," she said, her voice soft. "Our house ghost was busy last night." Rose tilted her head, her expression serious. "He's not a ghost," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's just..." Quiet. She took the bird back and placed it carefully in the pocket of her worn dress, patting it as if to reassure it. The simple meal was a noisy affair, a small pocket of domestic chaos that Lyra cherished. But beneath the surface of it, a current of anxiety ran through her. The discovery of another gift, as lovely as it was, had unsettled her more than usual. It felt different. More present. Last night, as she had lain in bed, she'd had the distinct and unnerving sensation of being watched, not by something in the house, but from the tree line, a gaze of immense weight and intensity. She'd told herself it was paranoia, the product of years spent looking over her shoulder. But the feeling lingered. After breakfast, the day's lessons began. Lyra taught them all herself, reading, writing, a bit of history from both the human and the fey worlds. But most importantly, she taught them about themselves. She taught Kale how to feel the song of the stone, taught Finn the names of the constellations sacred to the Fae, taught the twins how to coax life from the garden soil. For Rose, the lessons were different. The girl had a wild, untamed magic in her, a deep connection to the earth that Lyra didn't fully understand. So she taught her what she could, the names of herbs, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to move through the woods without a sound. Today, as they sat in the garden weeding the vegetable patch, Rose was unusually thoughtful. She paused, her small hands still in the dark earth, and looked up at Lyra. "Did my mother love gardens?" The question caught Lyra off guard. It was a subject they rarely breached. Lyra had told all the children the same gentle, edited truth, that their parents had loved them very much, but that the world was not ready for families like theirs, and that this was the safest place for them. "I believe she did," Lyra answered carefully, her fingers working to pull a stubborn thistle. "The person who brought you here left a rose petal with you. I always thought it was her way of telling you that you were meant to grow beautiful things." Rose seemed to accept this. She went back to her weeding, but her next words, spoken to the soil, sent a shiver through Lyra. "He smells like the forest after it rains." "Who does, sweetling?" Lyra asked, her voice tight. "The quiet man," Rose said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She didn't look up. "He was watching us last night. He made the bad dogs go away." Lyra's blood ran cold. Bad dogs. A child's term for wolves, or something worse. She dropped the thistle and knelt in front of Rose, taking the girl's small, dirt-stained hands in her own. "Rose, what did you see? Did you have a bad dream?" Rose finally looked at her, her dark eyes clear and certain. "It wasn't a dream. I was awake. I looked out the window. There was a man in the trees. He was very tall. And the dogs were snarling, but they were afraid of him. He didn't make a sound, and then, they were gone. He stayed for a long time after." He was watching our window. She patted the pocket where the nightingale was hidden. He wanted to make sure we were safe. Lyra's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The ghost, the benefactor, was real. A man. A protector who engaged in silent, deadly battles at the edge of their property while they slept. Her fear and her gratitude warred within her, creating a dizzying, nauseating conflict. He was keeping them safe. But his presence meant that the danger was closer, more real, than she had ever allowed herself to believe. That night, Lyra didn't just renew the wards. She reinforced them, pouring every ounce of her energy into the shimmering barrier until sweat beaded on her forehead and her hands trembled. The house was a fortress, but she suddenly felt as though its walls were made of glass. The memory was a ghost that walked beside him, a constant companion through the long, lonely centuries. Adrian stood on the precipice of a high cliff overlooking the sea, the wind tearing at his cloak, but he felt nothing of its chill. He was lost in the sun-drenched memory of another time, another life. Ilara. Her name was a wound that had never healed. She had been a daughter of a noble human house, full of laughter and a fierce, vibrant love for a world that was so much younger and brighter than his own. They had met by chance, a king of shadows and a lady of light, and their love had been a brief, impossible miracle. He had been willing to abdicate his throne, to shed his ancient lineage, to live a mortal life with her. But their love had not been a secret for long. His court, steeped in tradition and purity of blood, saw her as a contamination. Her family saw him as a monster from a dark fairy tale. They were pursued, harried from one hiding place to another, their love a flickering candle in a hurricane. Ilara had become pregnant, a thing of terror and joy. An heir. A child who would carry both their bloodlines, a bridge between two worlds. It was his greatest hope and his deepest fear. It was also the weapon his enemies had been waiting for. The sorcerer lord he had vanquished decades before had laid his curse not on Adrian, but on his line. A dormant poison, waiting for the moment of his greatest joy to strike. He remembered the birth with a clarity that was its own form of torture. It had happened in a hidden cottage, much like the sanctuary, with only a midwife in attendance. He had held Ilara's hand, whispering promises he would never be able to keep. Rose was born as the sun set, a perfect, healthy child with her mother's eyes and a wisp of his own dark hair. Ilara had held her for only a moment, a smile of transcendent joy on her face. And then the curse had struck. It had not been a physical attack, but a cold, creeping magic that had leached the life from her. She had died with that smile on her lips, her eyes on their daughter. In the same instant, the second part of the curse had coiled around Adrian's own heart. He had reached for his child, his newborn daughter, and a searing, agonizing pain had ripped through him, the curse screaming its conditions into his very soul. Claim her and she dies. He had been paralyzed by grief and horror. He could not touch her. He could not speak her name. He was a father and yet not a father, his love a death sentence. He had found a wet nurse, a kind woman from a nearby village, and paid her handsomely to care for the infant. And then he had disappeared into the shadows, a king returning to a throne he no longer wanted, his heart a hollow cavern. For years, he had watched from a distance, ensuring Rose was cared for. But as she grew, the danger to her became more apparent. Whispers of a half-blood child of the Shadow King began to circulate. He knew he could not keep her hidden in the mortal world forever. He needed a place of absolute safety, a place run by someone who understood the unique peril of her existence. His search had led him to Lyra. He had heard rumors of her, a woman who had defied both Fae and human courts to create a sanctuary for the abandoned. He'd investigated her, his methods ruthless and thorough. He'd learned of her own past, of the heartbreak that had forged her into this shield for the defenseless. At first, he'd seen her as a tool, a means to an end. A capable warden for his daughter. He had brought Rose to her doorstep in the dead of night, his heart breaking with every step. He had placed the sleeping infant in the basket, along with a pouch of gold that would last for years, and a single petal from the last rose Ilara had ever held. He had watched from the trees as Lyra opened the door, her expression of surprise melting into one of fierce, immediate compassion. In that moment, watching her lift his daughter into her arms and carry her into the warmth and light of the house, something within him had begun to shift. He had thought his heart had died with Ilara. He had been wrong. It had merely been sleeping, frozen in grief. Watching Lyra, year after year, had been a slow, agonizing thaw. He watched her teach Rose to read, to braid her own hair, to be kind. He saw her love, freely and fiercely given, nourish his daughter in a way he never could. And that gratitude, that awe, had slowly, imperceptibly, blossomed into love. A different love from what he'd felt for Ilara. This was not the bright, passionate flame of youth. It was a deep, slow-burning fire, forged in admiration, respect, and a shared, unspoken devotion to the same precious life. He loved her for her strength, for her sacrifice, for being everything he was not. He was a king of shadows, and she, in her crumbling house full of lost children, was a queen of light. The signs grew more frequent, more brazen. A trio of dead crows arranged in a spiral on the path just beyond the wards, their feathers black against the damp earth. A deep, claw-like scratch carved into the ancient oak that marked the edge of the property. Lyra found them during her morning patrols, each discovery a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The hunters were testing the boundaries, growing bolder. Rose's bad dogs had been a vanguard. Lyra's days took on a new, frantic edge. The lessons on herbalism and history were supplemented with drills on evasion and concealment. She hated it. She hated the fear she saw dawning in the children's eyes as she showed them the hidden bolt holes in the cellar, the secret passage behind the pantry. She was teaching them to be hunted, and the injustice of it was a bitter taste in her mouth. "Why do we have to hide, Lyra?" Mathis asked one afternoon, his small face pinched with a worry that no child should have to bear. "We haven't done anything wrong." Lyra paused, her hand on the heavy stone that concealed the entrance to their emergency tunnel. "No, you haven't," she said, her voice softer than she felt. "You haven't done anything wrong at all. The world is just confused. It's afraid of things it doesn't understand. And until it understands, we have to be smart, and we have to be safe." It was a weak answer, and she knew it. Her anxiety made her sharp, her patience thin. She felt the weight of their 7 lives on her shoulders, a crushing pressure. And through it all, the presence of the Watcher grew more palpable. She felt his eyes on her as she worked in the garden, a heavy, sorrowful gaze that seemed to penetrate her very bones. It was no longer just a feeling, it was a certainty. He was there, a constant, silent fixture in the trees. One evening, after the children were in bed, a storm rolled in, a violent tempest that shook the old house to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows and wind howled in the chimney. Lyra stood in the darkened kitchen, watching the lightning split the sky, illuminating the thrashing trees in stark, monochrome flashes. She was bone-weary, her fear a living thing coiling in her gut. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. A sudden, sharp crack from the front of the house, distinct from the sounds of the storm, sent her heart leaping into her throat. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, her knuckles white, and crept through the hall. She expected to find a shattered window, a broken ward. Instead, resting on the floor just inside the main door, was a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. It hadn't been there a moment ago. He had been on her very doorstep. The wards should have repelled him, or at least alerted her with a flare of light. But there had been nothing. Her hands shaking, Lyra knelt and unwrapped the package. Inside were 2 items. The first was a dagger, its blade forged of a pale, shimmering silver, its hilt wrapped in dark, supple leather. It was perfectly balanced, humming with a latent power she could feel against her skin. It was a weapon of immense quality, meant for killing things that were not entirely mortal. The second item was a small, intricately folded map, drawn on a piece of vellum that felt impossibly old. It showed the sanctuary, but also a network of hidden paths through the mountains, leading to a place marked only with a single, stark sigil of a crown wreathed in shadow. An escape route. This was not a toy. This was not a comforting trinket. This was a warning. He knew. He knew what was coming. He was arming her, showing her a way out. The gesture was one of protection, but it felt like an indictment of her own failure to keep them safe. Tears of frustration and fear pricked at her eyes. She clutched the cold, hard steel of the dagger and stared at the door, at the raging storm beyond. "Why won't you show yourself?" she whispered into the roaring dark. "Why won't you help me?" The wind howled its answer, a long, mournful cry that offered no comfort, no solace, only the promise of more darkness to come. The air in the forest was electric, charged with impending violence. Adrian could taste it, a metallic tang on his tongue. The hunters were no longer testing the boundaries, they were gathering. A full pack, at least a dozen strong, drawn by the bounty on half-blood children and the dark thrill of the chase. They were professionals, their magic crude but effective, their hearts cold and empty. He stood on a high ridge overlooking the valley where the sanctuary lay nestled, a single point of faint, warm light in a sea of encroaching darkness. The storm that had raged earlier was the vanguard of his own fury. He had felt Lyra's fear, her desperation, as keenly as if it were his own. Leaving the dagger and the map had been an act of desperation. He was trying to give her the tools to survive what was coming, a silent, inadequate apology for the fact that his very presence was what drew the danger to her door. His internal conflict was a raging tempest that mirrored the one in the sky. Every instinct, every fiber of his being, screamed at him to go to her, to stand beside her, to lend his strength to her defenses. But the curse held him in its icy grip. To reveal himself would be to invite questions he could not answer without endangering Rose. To speak his daughter's name, to claim his connection to her, was to sign her death warrant. 4 years, he had accepted this terrible bargain. He would be the silent guardian, the faceless protector. He would live in the shadows so that his daughter could live in the light. But now, that bargain was breaking. The hunters were too many, too determined. Lyra's wards were strong, born of love and fierce intent, but they were not invincible. They would be worn down, battered, and broken. And he would have to watch. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over him. What kind of a king, what kind of a father, what kind of a man, stood by and watched the woman he loved and the child he adored face slaughter? The curse was meant to punish him, to isolate him in his love. He would not allow it to destroy them, too. His decision, when it came, was not a thought but a physical reaction. A shift in his very essence. The centuries of grief, of silent observation, of repressed love and rage, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard resolve. The curse demanded his silence and his distance. So be it. He would not speak his daughter's name. He would not claim her. But he would not stand by and watch her die. He drew his own blade, a length of shadow-forged steel that seemed to drink the moonlight. Its name was Silence, and it had not been drawn in a century. Power, cold and ancient, rose in him, his form sharpening, the shadows around him deepening and clinging to him like a royal cloak. The sorrowful watcher in the woods was gone. In his place stood Adrian, the Shadow King, his eyes burning with a light that had laid waste to armies and humbled gods. He looked down at the sanctuary one last time. He saw a light move from window to window, Lyra, making her rounds, her small, determined form a beacon against the night. His heart ached with a love so profound it was a physical pain. "Forgive me," he whispered to her, though she could not hear him. He was about to shatter her world, to bring the violence she had fought so hard to keep at bay directly to her doorstep. He was about to become the monster she never knew she needed. He descended the ridge, not a wraith now, but an avalanche, a silent, unstoppable force of destruction moving to meet the coming tide. The wards broke just after midnight. There was no loud explosion, no dramatic shattering. It was a soft, sickening sigh, like the last breath leaving a body. A silver shimmer, a flicker, and then nothing. The protective silence that had enveloped the sanctuary for years was gone, replaced by a sudden, predatory stillness. Lyra was in the main hall, the silver dagger in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had felt the hunter's approach for the last hour, a methodical, brutal assault on her defenses. She had poured her own energy into the wards, feeding them until she was dizzy and trembling, but it wasn't enough. To the cellar, now, she shouted, her voice tight with a control she did not feel. The children, already awake and dressed in their traveling clothes, scrambled from the dormitory. Finn was crying silently, his face pale. Cale clutched Mathis's hand, his knuckles white. Lyra herded them toward the kitchen, toward the hidden passage. Her eyes scanned their faces, counting. 1, 2, 3, 6. "Where is Rose?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. Ilara pointed a trembling finger toward the dormitory. "She went back. For the bird." A curse caught in Lyra's throat. "Of course. The nightingale." She shoved the oldest boy, Finn, toward the cellar door. "Get them inside. Bar the door. Do not open it until I come for you. Do you understand?" Finn nodded, his youthful face set in a grim, terrified imitation of bravery. Lyra didn't wait for another answer. She sprinted back down the hall, the dagger held low. The front door splintered inward, exploding into a shower of wood and iron. 3 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the moonlit night. They were tall and gaunt, clad in dark leather, their faces obscured by deep hoods. The air grew cold, carrying the stench of dark magic and old blood. Lyra didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the dormitory, slamming the heavy oak door shut and dropping the bar just as the first heavy blow struck it from the other side. Rose was standing by the window, clutching the small wooden bird to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "Come on, baby, we have to go," Lyra gasped, grabbing the girl's hand. She dragged her toward a small tapestry on the far wall, one depicting a tranquil forest scene. She ripped it aside, revealing a narrow opening, a dark, dusty passage meant for servants in a bygone era. It was their last resort. The door to the dormitory groaned, the wood splintering. Another blow, and the bar cracked. Lyra pushed Rose toward the opening. "Go. All the way to the end. Don't stop." But as Rose scrambled inside, a 4th figure appeared, not at the door, but at the window. It moved with a liquid grace, shattering the glass with a silent, contemptuous flick of its wrist and dropping into the room. This one was different. Taller, broader, and carrying a long, cruel-looking axe. He saw Lyra, saw the escaping child, and smiled, a flash of white teeth in the gloom. Lyra shoved Rose fully into the passage and turned to face him, placing her body between the hunter and her child. She raised the silver dagger, her arm shaking but her resolve absolute. This was it. The end of her stand. She would die here, in this room, and buy her children a few more seconds of life. The hunter advanced, his axe held casually, his confidence an insult. He was savoring this. And then, the world outside the window erupted in a storm of silent, terrifying violence. A blur of motion, a flash of dark steel. One of the hunters in the hall let out a choked, gurgling scream that was cut brutally short. The pounding on the door stopped. The hunter with the axe froze, his head snapping toward the window. A figure landed on the sill, as silent as a hunting owl. He was tall, dressed in black, his face cast in shadow, but it was the power that rolled off him in palpable waves that made the air crackle. It was an ancient, kingly power, cold and absolute. He held a sword that seemed to be forged from night itself, and it dripped with the fresh blood of the hunters he had just dispatched in the hall. The axe-wielding hunter took an involuntary step back, his bravado evaporating. A name, a title, was ripped from his throat in a choked whisper. The Shadow King. Adrian didn't speak. His eyes, glowing with a faint, silver light, were fixed on the hunter. But for a split second, they flicked to Lyra, to the child disappearing into the secret passage. It was all the opening his opponent needed. The hunter roared and charged, swinging his axe in a wide, desperate arc. Adrian moved. He wasn't just fast, he was non-existent. He was there, and then he was not. The axe whistled through empty air, embedding itself in the floorboards. Adrian reappeared behind the hunter, his blade a whisper against the man's throat. There was no struggle. Just a soft sigh, and the hunter crumpled to the floor, his life spilling out in a dark pool on the wood. Silence. The entire, brutal confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. The house was still. The immediate threat was gone. Lyra stood frozen, the silver dagger still clutched in her hand, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. This man, this king, had appeared from nowhere and saved them. He was the Watcher. The ghost. Rose's quiet man. He turned to face her. He moved out of the shadows of the window, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly in the moonlight. It was a face of stark, aristocratic beauty, etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed carved into his bones. His eyes, no longer glowing with battle light, were dark and full of an impossible pain. And they were fixed on her. The adrenaline that had sustained her fled, leaving behind a trembling, visceral rage. The terror of the last few minutes, the fear of the last 8 years, the crushing loneliness of her long, thankless fight, it all crested within her in a single, volcanic wave. "You," she breathed, her voice shaking with fury. She took a step toward him, the dagger still raised. "You were out there. All this time. You were watching." The silence in the ruined dormitory was heavier than any sound. The bodies of the hunters lay still on the floor, dark shapes in the moonlight. The wind whispered through the shattered window, rustling the tapestry that concealed the secret passage. Adrian stood amidst the carnage he had wrought, his dark sword still in his hand, its tip resting on the floorboards. He did not look like a savior. He looked like death itself. And Lyra, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, advanced on him. Her fear had burned away, leaving behind the pure, white-hot fuel of her rage. "You watched," she repeated, her voice low and trembling, each word a stone cast at him. "I have struggled for years. I have begged, and scraped, and gone without sleep, terrified every single night that this would happen. I have patched these walls and mended these clothes and fed 7 mouths with barely enough for 2. And you were out there, in the woods, watching it all." He said nothing. He just looked at her, his face a mask of impenetrable sorrow. His silence was more infuriating than any defense he could have offered. "Who are you to watch us?" she spat, taking another step closer. She was near enough now to see the fine silver threads in his dark hair, the ancient weariness in his eyes. "To leave your little trinkets on our doorstep like we are some charity case? To let me believe I was alone in this fight? You could have helped. You could have stood with me. But you chose to hide in the shadows." Her voice broke on the last word. The injustice of it was a physical blow. All the nights she had cried herself to sleep from sheer exhaustion and loneliness. All the times she had felt the cold hand of despair, believing she was the only shield between her children and a world that wanted them dead. He had been there. He had seen it. And he had done nothing. "I am their mother," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. "I have earned that right through blood and tears and fear. You have no right. No right to watch them, no right to be here in my home, among the bodies of the monsters you finally decided to deal with." He finally lowered his sword, the sound of its tip scraping against the wood gratingly loud in the stillness. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on the tapestry, on the hidden passage where his daughter was concealed. The pain in his expression was so raw, so naked, that it momentarily staggered her. "I could not," he said, his voice a rough, unused thing, like stones grinding together. It was the voice of a man who had not spoken in a very long time. "Could not," she scoffed, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping her. "You are the Shadow King. That is what he called you. A king. You have power I cannot even imagine, and you are telling me you could not help." The dam of his composure finally broke. He took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think I did not want to?" he asked, his voice cracking with an agony that stunned her into silence. "You think I enjoyed watching you struggle? Every moment of your hardship was a dagger in my heart. Every night you spent in fear was a century of torment for me." He stopped, standing just out of her reach. He looked from the tapestry back to her face, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "There is a curse, Lyra. An ancient, unbreakable curse. The girl. Rose, she is my daughter." The words dropped into the silent room and shattered Lyra's reality. Rose. His daughter. The quiet girl with the wild magic. The gifts, always for her. The way she seemed to know about the Watcher. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, perfect logic. "Your daughter," she whispered, the dagger suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. "Her mother died giving birth to her," Adrian continued, the words torn from him, each one a fresh wound. "And the curse settled upon me. I cannot claim her. I cannot speak her name as my own, I cannot touch her, I cannot be her father. The moment I do, her heart will stop. My love is a poison to her. My acknowledgement is her death. He looked at her, his kingly facade stripped away, leaving only a broken man. So yes, I watched. I watched from the shadows because it was the only way I could be near her. I left gifts because it was the only way I could give her anything. I guarded this house every night because it was the only way I could protect her. I found you, the strongest, most compassionate soul I had ever known, and I gave you the most precious thing in my world, because I could not care for her myself. He took a final, shuddering breath, his gaze locking with hers, holding her captive. The confession she had demanded was coming, but it was not the one she had expected. I gave her to you to keep her safe, he said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, raw, and devastatingly sincere. And you did more than that. You gave her a home. You gave her brothers and sisters. You gave her joy. You gave my daughter everything I couldn't: love, safety, a mother. He paused, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken, unbearable emotion. His next words were not for a subordinate, not for an ally, but for the woman who had unknowingly become the center of his desolate world. Watching you, he whispered, his voice thick with the weight of 1,000 lonely nights, watching you love her, watching you be everything I could never be, made me fall hopelessly in love with you. Lyra stood, frozen, the confession echoing in the ruined room. It was too much. The attack, the revelation of Rose's parentage, the curse, and now this declaration of love from a shadowed king who had been a ghost in her life for 8 years. Her anger, so solid and righteous moments before, dissolved, leaving her feeling hollowed out, adrift in a sea of shock and a strange, burgeoning empathy. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the king, past the warrior. She saw a father torn apart by a terrible choice. She saw a man who had condemned himself to a life of silent observation, his heart breaking anew each day as he watched his child grow up without him. He had not been hiding from the fight, he had been trapped in a prison of his own love. The silver dagger slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound shockingly loud. Her rage was gone, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow. A sorrow for him, for the years he had lost. A sorrow for Rose, who had a father she could never know. And a sorrow for herself, for the loneliness she had endured when a kindred spirit had been suffering just beyond her walls. She thought of all the gifts. The carved bird, the book of herbs, the silver dagger. They were not charity. They were letters. They were a father's desperate, silent attempts to speak to his child, to protect the woman raising her. He had been with them all along, in his own terrible, solitary way. You love her, Lyra stated, the words soft, not an accusation but a realization. That's why he's not a ghost, she murmured, remembering Rose's words. He's just quiet. Her child had sensed it all along. Sensed the sorrowful, loving presence in the woods. Adrian nodded, his throat working. He seemed unable to speak, as if his confession had taken his last reserves of strength. Lyra's heart, which had been a knot of fear and fury, began to ache with a different emotion. It was compassion, profound and overwhelming. It was understanding. And beneath it, something else, something she had fiercely suppressed for years. A feeling for the mysterious guardian, a strange sense of not being entirely alone, a warmth she had attributed to the house's spirit but now saw was him. It was a connection she had felt but never acknowledged, and now it bloomed in the space between them, terrifying and beautiful. She saw the choice before her. She could cling to her anger, to the grievance of her lonely struggle. Or she could accept this impossible, heartbreaking truth. She could see the love behind his silence. Slowly, deliberately, she took a step toward him. He flinched, as if expecting a blow. But she didn't stop. She closed the distance between them, stepping over the fallen body of the hunter, until she was standing directly in front of him. She could feel the cold aura of his power, but beneath it, she could feel him trembling. She did not say a word. Words were inadequate for this moment. Instead, she raised her hand, not in anger, but in offering. It was a gesture that cost her everything: her pride, her fear, her carefully constructed defenses. It was an act of pure, unthinking grace. She laid her palm gently against his cheek. His skin was cold, like stone that had lain too long in shadow. But beneath it, she felt a tremor run through him. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the dust and grime on his face. He leaned into her touch, a desperate, silent surrender. It was not a forgiveness she was offering. It was something more. It was acceptance. It was the simple, profound act of being seen. Her love for her children was a fierce, protective fire. But this quiet, freely given gesture of understanding for the broken king in front of her, was a different kind of magic altogether. And in that moment of contact, something in the world shifted. A warmth spread from her hand, a gentle, golden light that flowed into him. The ancient coldness that clung to him, the icy grip of the curse around his soul, began to recede. He gasped, his eyes flying open, filled with disbelief. A faint, silver filigree of light appeared on his skin, tracing the lines of the curse, before shattering into a million motes of dust, like a broken chain. The air in the room grew warm, sweet, and clean. The oppressive weight that had filled the space was gone. The curse was broken. Not by a grand ritual, not by a powerful counterspell, but by a simple, selfless act of love given without condition or demand. Lyra's love, freely offered to him, had undone the magic that had decreed his own love must be a poison. For a long moment, Adrian could only stare at her, his mind reeling. He could feel the change in his very being. The shard of ice that had been lodged in his heart for decades had melted away, leaving behind only a warmth that was almost painful in its unfamiliarity. He was free. His gaze snapped to the tapestry. He moved toward it, his steps hesitant at first, then more certain. He pulled the heavy fabric aside, revealing the dark, narrow passage. "Rose," he called, his voice thick with emotion. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud with hope instead of fear. A small face peered out from the darkness. Rose looked at him, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a strange, dawning recognition. She had always known him, in a way. He was the quiet man, the smell of the forest after rain. Adrian knelt, sinking to one knee on the floor of the ruined room, bringing himself to her level. He was a king, but in this moment, he was only a father. He held out a hand, his fingers trembling. "Rose," he said again, his voice breaking. "My daughter. I am your father." Rose stepped out of the passage. She looked from his outstretched hand to his face, and then she looked at Lyra, who stood by the window, her own tears finally falling. Lyra gave a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, Rose walked to him. She did not take his hand. Instead, she reached up with her small fingers and, with the same innate gentleness Lyra had just shown him, touched his cheek. It was a perfect echo of the gesture that had set him free. Adrian let out a sob, a sound torn from the very depths of his soul. He wrapped his arms around his daughter, pulling her into an embrace 8 years in the making. He buried his face in her dark hair, which smelled of lavender and sleep, and held her as if he would never let go. Rose, after a moment of stillness, hugged him back, her small arms wrapping around his neck, her head resting on his shoulder as if she had been born to be there. Lyra watched them, her heart so full it felt it might burst. The other children, hearing the silence, crept out from the cellar, their faces pale and frightened, and stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the dead hunters, the broken door, and this strange, powerful man weeping as he held their sister. Adrian eventually looked up, his eyes meeting Lyra's over Rose's head. His daughter was safe in his arms, the curse was broken, and it was all because of this woman. This indomitable, courageous, loving woman. He gently set Rose down, though he kept a hand on her shoulder, a physical connection he had been denied for so long. He rose to his full height and walked to Lyra. The children huddled behind her, peering out at him. He took her hand, his touch now warm and solid. "The world I come from is one of shadows and politics, of ancient laws and cold thrones," he said, his voice clear and strong now, filled with a new purpose. "It is no place to raise a child. Not alone." He looked from her to the 7 scared faces behind her. "You have been a mother to all of them. You have been their light in the darkness. My world needs a light like that. My daughter needs her mother. And I," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, his eyes full of a love that was no longer hopeless, "need my queen." It was not a command. It was a plea, an offer, a beginning. He was offering her not just a crown, but a partnership. A family. A future where none of them would ever have to be afraid or alone again. Lyra looked at Rose, who was now holding Adrian's hand, a perfect bridge between them. She looked at Finn, and Kale, and the twins, and all her children. Their safety, their happiness, was all she had ever wanted. Here it was, being offered in the hands of a king who loved them. Who loved her. A slow smile spread across her face, a true, radiant smile that lit up her tired features and made her beautiful. "The children will need a bigger garden," she said. It was the only answer he needed. In the days that followed, the sanctuary was transformed. Adrian's people arrived, silent, grey-clad sentinels who moved with quiet efficiency. They were not the monsters of legend, but a disciplined, loyal folk who looked upon Lyra with a deep and immediate reverence. They repaired the broken door, replaced the shattered window, and erased all signs of the hunter's attack, their work a silent promise of a new, safer era. The house, once a crumbling refuge, began to feel like a true home, open and breathing, no longer holding its breath in fear. The children, at first wary of the newcomers, soon relaxed under Lyra's calm guidance. They discovered that the stern-faced king could also be coaxed into a game of hide-and-seek, his solemnity melting away when Rose tagged him with a shriek of laughter. They learned that his shadowed court was not a place of horror, but a kingdom in need of the warmth and life they brought with them. Adrian and Rose were inseparable. He spent hours with her, making up for lost time. He taught her the names of the stars in the language of his people, showed her how to feel the deep, slow magic of the stones, and listened with rapt attention as she told him all about her life, about her brothers and sisters, and about Lyra. Through his daughter's eyes, he saw the full scope of the miracle Lyra had wrought, the vibrant, loving family she had built from broken pieces. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Adrian and Lyra stood on the porch, watching the children play in the garden. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. For the first time in nearly a decade, Lyra felt no tension in her shoulders, no hum of anxiety in her veins. She felt only a deep, quiet peace. "I used to stand here," she said softly, "and I would try to feel the edges of the world. It always felt like it was pressing in, trying to crush this place. Now, it feels like it's opened up." Adrian slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. His touch was a comforting, solid warmth against her side. "I spent so many years believing my love was a destructive force," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "You showed me that love is the only thing that creates. It builds, it heals, it makes things new." He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "I want to build a new world with you, Lyra. One where no child, half-blood or otherwise, has to live in fear. Our kingdom will be a sanctuary for all of them." It was a future larger and brighter than any she had ever dared to imagine for herself. A queen, a partner, a mother to a nation of lost children. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and absolutely right. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her gaze on Rose, who was showing Kale the proper way to talk to a rosebush. The girl was laughing, a sound as bright and clear as a bell, a sound her father had waited his entire life to hear. He had watched from the shadows, a king in exile from his own heart. She had fought in the light, a queen defending a crumbling castle. Together, they had forged a family, not of blood or law, but of a fierce and tender